So living with housemates is an endless opportunity for growth. Growing opportunities abound. I had a new housemate move in about 2 years ago, and I knew her in the community peripherally. I kind of knew of her, and I liked her, and I was really excited for her to move in and to get to know her more. And pretty soon after she moved in, we discovered that it wasn't a great match. We just couldn't quite find each other, and we had really different ways of being in the space, of sharing a living space. She left a lot of dirty dishes, and she talked on the phone in the common space, and she watched videos in the common space, and she had a cat that she wanted to be able to move in and out of her room, so she left the door open so I could hear everything that happened in her room. And I made a lot of requests for some of these things to change, and they didn't change, and it was frustrating, and we really liked each other, but we just had really different ways of living together. And then there was the garden. And I had been living in this house for several years, and it was my garden. Nobody else that I had lived with had wanted to garden with me, so this was really my garden. And although I had had garden buddies in the past, this became like a solo project for me. And I loved my garden. But she wanted to garden, and I said, that was great, let's garden together. So, but we were just we just couldn't figure it out. I would cleared a bed to plant some seeds, and did plant some seeds, and then the next day she dug it up and put some plants in, not knowing that seeds were there. And I had this little bed of these little tender perennials coming up, and she dug it up and put plants in. And I had my it was right in the middle of the kale bed, she planted a lavender plant. And it just annoyed me. I tried so hard to be generous, but I just was perpetually annoyed. And I felt like a bad person for being perpetually annoyed, because it was a garden, it was plants, it's life. So we did our best. We even talked about actually not living together. We really liked each other, but we talked about maybe it's not a great fit. But she stayed because she actually had cancer. And she was at this point in chemo treatment, and it wasn't a great time for her to be moving. And things were good. Everything was working, the tumors were shrinking, her counts were low, things were going really well. So she stayed, and we kept doing our best. One day she came home, and I found her in the living room, kind of lost, kind of disoriented, and I was like, what's going on? And she looked at her arm, and she tried to make words, and she couldn't make words. And she said, I need some food, and I brought her a bowl of eggs, and I gave her the fork, and she said, what do I do with that? And so I picked up the fork, and I got a spoonful of food to bring to her mouth, and I could see her brain trying to figure out how to get the food into her mouth. And that was when I called 911, and the paramedics came and took her to the hospital. I came to the Story Slam, and then after the Story Slam, I went to the hospital and learned that they had done a brain scan, and she had tumors in her brain. And at that point, she decided not to do any further treatment and started preparing to die. So we became fast family. And suddenly, the dirty dishes didn't matter. And the fact that there was a lavender plant in the middle of the kale bed didn't matter. And I and a team of friends showed up to care for her during this time. And there were people in and out of the house all the time, and I loved it. And Miles and I would go sit on the porch and watch the garden. And as things started to get harder and more painful for her, and she was spending more and more time, there was the point where she was mostly in bed, and there was one position where she didn't feel pain. She could sleep in the bed in one position where she didn't feel pain, but she would fall out of that position and couldn't get herself back in that position. So I would 2 or 3 times in the night go and turn her back into that position. And it was this incredible, intimate time where her letting me in so closely to her life and her death was so generous. And people would say that must be so hard, and I would say there is nothing hard about this, about showing up and being with a person who is dying. When it became close to the end, I was sitting with her one day, and we knew that the end was very near, and another friend was in the room, and we were sitting there talking about the day and who was going to come and be with her, and we both turned because we noticed her breathing change, and we became very still. And she had this very, very laborious inhale, and then a rattled exhale, and a pause. And then a very laborious inhale, and a rattled exhale, and a pause. And the nurse had said there could be up to 2 minutes between breaths. So there was a very laborious inhale, and a rattled exhale. And then there was no more inhale. This morning, I was digging in the garden, and I was so happy to be seeing the flowers finding their way up, and the plants. And I came upon the lavender plant. There it was, in the middle of the kale bed, in the middle of last year's kale bed. And the lavender plant was so beautiful, and I had this impulse to text Miles and say, Miles, the lavender plant is doing great. Miles, the lavender plant is doing great.